Parish Council meeting to order. Official time now is 6:03. Starting with the prayer and the pledge. A prayer led by Mr. Eugene Olivier and the pledge by Mr. Joe Dugas.
In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we ask you to guide us here tonight in this budget process. We ask that we be fair for everyone involved. Lord, we pray for all those that are ill in the parish and need our help and our prayers. Lord, protect our veterans serving in the military. And Lord, protect this great country we live in. Please, Lord, grant that everyone who's involved in our country's decision make wise decisions for everyone. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Praise the flag and repeat after me. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Madam Clerk, initiate the roll call.
Tommy Pollard.
Here.
Michael Landry.
Here.
Tommy Landry.
Here.
Lloyd Brown. Warren Goshasang.
Here.
Natalie Broussard. Paul Landry.
Here.
Ricky Gonsalves.
Here.
Joel Dugas.
Here.
Eugene Olivier.
Here.
Brian Napier. Berwick Francis.
Here.
Marty Trahan.
Here.
Chad Macharan.
12 members in the quorum. Going on to public comments. I'll need a motion to go into public comments.
Move.
I have a motion by Mr. Gonsalves and a motion by Mr. Michael Landry. Mr. Gonsalves, do you waive?
I wait.
Waive in. We are now in public comments. We'll, from this point on, we'll take comments from the general public on non-agenda items. Did we receive any, Madam Clerk?
No.
We've received no requests to speak on non-agenda items. Moving on to number 2, comments from the general public on agenda items. Have we received any, Madam Clerk?
No.
We have not received any general public requests on agenda items tonight. Is there anyone in the House that would like to speak on any agenda items presented tonight that has not had a chance to fill a card out? Hearing none, I'll need a motion to go back into regular session.
Move to close.
Motion by Mr. Olivier and a second by Mr. Gonsalves. Mr. Gonsalves, do you waive?
I wait.
That motion carries. I don't see it. Vote, I'm sorry, vote your machine, should I say first? Might be better. Mr. Dugas? Who else are we missing? Just Bruce Orson here. That motion carries unanimously. Moving on to council member announcements. Is there any member of the council that would like to make an announcement? Madam Chair, Madam Clerk, Mr. Gonsalves has requested.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to make an announcement that Food for Families will be held this Tuesday, December 5th, 7 to 6, well, starting at 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. at the Sugarcane Festival Building. And all these canned goods and whatever you can donate is going to be donated to local charities, the Glorious Church, Mount Calvary Baptist Church, St. Francis Diner, St. Nicholas Social Concerns, the Social Service Center, and Solomon House Outreach. They're in need of donations, so if you can spread the word, please come out and donate. It'd be kindly appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Madam Clerk, Mr. Brown has requested to speak.
Yeah. I just want to thank Larry and his staff, also all the directors, for this nice budget that y'all turned in. I mean, it's something that I could live with.
Madam Clerk, Mr. Michael Landry has requested to speak. Mr. Landry?
Yes, I want to give a special thanks to Larry Richard, our parish president. He was able to attend our 100-year anniversary at St. Edward's Catholic Church, and he did a proclamation. Really appreciate it, and we really enjoyed having you there. Thank you. Thank you.
Madam Clerk, Mr. Pollard has requested to speak.
Yes, just want to thank Ms. Juanita for doing a real good job at St. Francis Diner, for having a Thanksgiving dinner, and Martin Salt. They paid for everything, and it was really fed over 400 people. That was last Wednesday. That's it.
That's it. Mr. Pollard is finished. Is there any other member of the council that would like to make a request to talk? Hearing none, moving on to the parish president announcements. Mr. Richard, you have the floor.
I don't have much to say tonight other than I think the parish council and the administration did a good job along with all of the directors going through the budget. Everything is balanced, and we have a balanced, or should I say a budget that I feel we can work with in 2018 if this budget is approved tonight. If approved, this is going to be the first time I remember our very parish government having an approved budget in November in quite some time. Not saying that we need to rush to approve the budget, but as a unit, as a parish government, I think we did a good job. That's it.
All right. Any questions for the parish president? Hearing no questions, moving on to ordinances introduced for public hearing and adoption tonight. Summary number 4854, introduced by Warren P. Goshenson, District 5, an ordinance adopting the 2018 general fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Brown, a second by Mr. Olivier. Mr. Brown, you've motioned first. Do you waive?
I waive.
Mr. Brown has waived. Is there any discussion? Yeah. The clerk's going to explain to you, seems to be some issues with the general fund. Should go ahead and explain what.
Okay, in your packets, you were mailed out the sheets that showed all the budgets. And in the general fund in section 3, it details the director's salaries. Those salaries were, the salaries in here were included the 2.5% in them, and we didn't realize that. We actually need to put the current salaries as they are right now, and then the 2.5% is included in the budget figures, in the total budget of each director's budget. And those have to be voted on separately at a finance committee meeting if the council chooses to approve their salaries at a 2.5% increase.
Mr. Brown?
Yeah, but we can go on and vote and pass it and then make that adjustment at that meeting. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, we just need to
Okay.
put these, change them back to adjust the correct salaries as they currently are. And then in a finance committee meeting, if you choose to give the 2.5% increase to the directors, then that goes to the finance committee to
Okay.
approve by resolution.
All right.
Mr. Brown, will you relinquish the floor?
Yeah.
Any other questions? Please vote your machines. That motion carries. Moving on to summary number 4855, introduced by Warren P. Goshenson, District 5, an ordinance adopting the 2018 16th JDC Juror and Witness Fees Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. I have a motion by Mr. Brown. I have a second by Mr. Trahan. Mr. Brown?
Right.
Mr. Brown waives. Mr. Trahan? Waives. Mr. Trahan waives. Is there any other questions or debate? Hearing no other debate, please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Moving on to summary number 4856, introduced by Warren P. Goshenson Jr., District 5, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Road District Number 10 Maintenance Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. I have a motion by Mr. Trahan and a second by Mr. Michael Landry. Mr. Trahan? Waive. Mr. Trahan waives. Is there any other discussion? Is there any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Moving on to summary number 4857. Ordinance is summary introduced by Warren P. Goshenson Jr., District 5, an ordinance adopting the 2018 parish-wide drainage maintenance fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Trahan, a second by Mr. Brown. Mr. Trahan? Waive. Mr. Brown?
Waive.
Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries that motion carries. Moving on to summary number 4858, introduced by Warren P. Goshenson Jr., District 5, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Public Library Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Brown, a second by Mr. Landry. Mr. Brown?
Waive.
Mr. Landry?
Waive.
Is there any more discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries. Summary number 4859, introduced by Warren P. Goshenson Jr., District 5, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Fire Protection District Number 1 fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Landry, Michael Landry, and a second by Mr. Olivier. Mr. Michael Landry?
Waive.
Is there any other discussion? I have one question. Did we ever get anything back from the Ronella Fire Department? Do we know a number yet?
Michael? No, they were, I think you're waiting for Brian, maybe? We met last week.
Okay, so y'all want to go ahead and pass it with the 69,000, and if there's any, you don't think there will be more?
If it's additional, we'll just have to come back.
Madam Clerk, please turn on Ms. Segura's mic.
We had included an appropriation for the Ronella Fire Station improvements. We'd included it at 125 in the budget. So if it's not necessary that all of that, like once the determination comes back as to what that price is going to be established at, we can always come back to remove the overage out.
Okay. No button. You want to press again? Mr. Dugas is not working. Go ahead and turn on Mr. Dugas's mic. Okay. Just go ahead and do it manually for Mr. Dugas.
Yeah, I did have a conversation with Mr. Napier today about that fire station. And the original request was for a roof only. And after they looked at it more, there was more than just a roof, and then they can appropriate some more money. So based on what you've got budgeted, I think that number was correct. So it just, we'll just have to deal with it at a later date. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Dugas relinquishes the floor. Is there any more discussion? Is there any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Moving on to summary number 4860, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Rabies Control Program fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Brown. Second by Mr. Trahan. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown waves. Mr. Trahan? Waves. Mr. Trahan waves. Okay, well, give me the next one. Mr. Brown waves. Mr. Trahan and Brown wave, but I got Mr. Gonsalves. Coming to you, Mr. Gonsalves. I don't know why it's doing that. So it should go to the next. I got it. Mr. Gonsalves?
Oh, okay. Mr. Richard, are we had any progress with intergovernmental agreement with the city on animal?
We're working on it, we're working on it.
Is that include, those costs included in this budget?
Yes,
Okay, so we're working on, we're not completed with it.
not completed.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion to table this one until we get an answer from the city on animal control. The first
Okay,
meeting.
I'm gonna hold it for a second. Is there any other discussion on the original motion? Hearing none, Mr. Gonsalves has initiated a second to table it to
Next meeting.
to the next full council meeting. Is there a second on the floor? A second by Mr. Paul Landry. I'll open up a discussion on the second. Anyone? Discussion on the substitution? Hearing no discussion on the substitution, I'll ask that you vote your machines to move this agenda item to the next meeting. Please vote your machines.
What are we voting? Say that?
This is he made a substitution to table to the next meeting.
I want to make sure that we get the intergovernmental agreement signed. So
And Ricky, so do you think we're gonna have an intergovernmental agreement signed by the city of New Iberia with their lawyers by the next meeting?
No, I'm just asking for an update.
Well, I'm giving you an update. The update is that we're in
Mr.
the
Richard.
process right, oh, I'm sorry.
Trust the chair, Mr. Richard.
Thank you so much, Chairman.
Mr. Gonsalves, can you get with the administration off to the side and get that going on? I think there's eggs and issues tomorrow. We can have the discussion between both of those guys.
That's fine.
Any objection to the substitution? And I think
Substitutions to table?
to table to the next meeting.
I got one comment.
Okay, we had a vote. Let's go ahead, Mr. Olivier. I'll give you the floor.
I just want to, I think it's something we can handle outside this budget process right here. I really think we need to go ahead and pass the budget and let Larry work this out with Mr. Gonsalves and the city of Iberia. Let's get this budget closed and get it moving. I think this is a minor detail we need to work out. I don't think it's that serious.
Okay, a vote has been cast. If there's no objection, I'll remove the vote. Is there? Mr. Landry, did you want to say something? Okay, I've asked, Madam Clerk, please remove the vote. Mr. Gonsalas, you were waiving your substitution? Mr. Gonsalas waives his substitution. Is there any objection to the waiver of the substitution? Hearing no objection, please vote your machine on the original motion.
As written?
As written, correct. That motion carries unanimously. Moving on to agenda summary number 4861, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Health Unit Maintenance Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. I have a motion by Mr. Brown and a second by Mr. Olivier. Mr. Brown? No. Mr. Brown waives. Is there any other discussion? Any objection to the fund? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Moving on to summary number 4862, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Economic Development District Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. I have a motion by Mr. Trahan and a second by Mr. Olivier. Mr. Trahan waives. Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion passes unanimously. Moving on to summary number 4863, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Solid Waste Sales Tax Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Brown and a second by Mr. Paul Landry. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown waives. Mr. Landry? Mr. Landry waives. Is there any more discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion passes unanimously. Summary number 4864, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Mosquito Control Drainage Improvement Sales Tax Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. I have a motion by Mr. Brown and a second by Mr. Paul Landry. Mr. Brown?
Wait.
Mr. Landry?
Wait.
Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. Mr. Paul Landry? That motion passes unanimously. Moving on to summary number 4865, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Communication District Commission Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. I have a motion by Mr. Trahan and a second by Mr. Paul Landry. Mr. Trahan?
Waive.
Mr. Trahan waives. Mr. Paul Landry?
Wait.
Mr. Landry waives. Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. Mr. Tommy Landry? Mr. Tommy Landry. That motion carries unanimously. Summary number 4866, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Criminal Justice Facility Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. I have a motion by Mr. Olivier and a second by Mr. Paul Landry. Mr. Paul Landry?
Wait.
Mr. Paul Landry waives. Mr. Gonsalas?
Scott, I think I talked to you. Where
Hold on,
we
Mr.
at?
Gonsalas, I'm trying to get you back up there.
Okay. Or Larry, whatever. Scott or Larry.
No, he's not. Wanna move him up? Okay, Mr. Gonsalas, go ahead.
Where are we at with the health contract with the jail as per moving forward, or? That's done. That's Scott, where are we at, Scott? Is it gonna affect the budget?
And it's gonna stay flat.
Gonna stay flat?
Yeah.
So-
We've spoken to the current provider. There's gonna be no change in the budget, so.
Already signed.
Yeah, we had a discussion with everybody involved and decided just to redo,
It's already signed.
just renew that contract.
Okay, so you renewed the current contract that's in place for 520,000, for whatever it was.
Yeah, and actually, we met, I discussed it or had a meeting with Parker with Iberia Medical. They're not interested in doing it.
So there was no option to maybe bid it out for cheaper services? I think that was
We
pretty.
tried, he did, good.
It might have went.
We talked to a couple of companies and,
Nothing cheaper.
we didn't get any pricing from them because if we go out to bid, we don't screw that up.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, both of them called back and did not feel that they could have met the obligations that we're getting from this vendor at the same price.
Okay, so that option was explored. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Gonsalas relinquishes the floor. Any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Summary number 4868, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Public Building Maintenance Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. I'm sorry, my apologies. Thank you, Marty. Summary number 4867 is an ordinance adopting the 2018 Disaster Relief Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. I have a motion by Mr. Paul Landry and a second by Mr. Olivier. Mr. You wave? Mr. Landry waves. Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Now moving on to summary number 4868, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Public Building Maintenance Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Michael Landry and a second by Mr. Trahan. Go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, there's one extra absent.
Okay, it's a ghost. All right. Mr. Landry.
Wave.
Mr. Landry waves. Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. It's not allowing me to. Oh, okay. That's no problem. Mr. Tron? Mr. Olivier? That motion passes. Summary number 4869, an ordinance adopting the 2018 HUD Voucher Program Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Brown and a second by Mr. Trahan. Mr. Brown waves. Mr. Trahan? Mr. Trahan waves. Any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Ordinance number, summary number 4870, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Adult Drug Court Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. Motion by Mr. Olivier and a second by Mr. Paul Landry. Mr. Olivier waves. Mr. Paul Landry? Mr. Landry waves. Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Summary number 4871, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Recreation and Playground Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. I have a motion by Mr. Olivier and a second by Mr. Trahan. Mr. Trahan? Any discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries. Summary number 4872, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Tourist Commission Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Paul Landry and a second by Mr. Olivier. Mr. Landry? Mr. Olivier waves also. Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Moving on to summary number 4873, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Industrial Development Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Olivier and a second by Mr. Paul Landry. Mr. Olivier waves. Mr. Paul Landry? Mr. Trahan? Waves. Please, any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Summary number 4874, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Bond Redemption Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Trahan and a second by Mr. Paul Landry. Mr. Trahan? Mr. Paul Landry? Any objection? Any more discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. Summary number 4875, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Public Library Sinking Fund budget as submitted. I need a motion by Mr. Brown, a second by Mr. Olivier. Mr. Brown? Any more discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Summary number 4876, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Royalty Fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. Motion by Mr. Paul Landry and a second by Mr. Olivier. Mr. Landry waves. Mr. Olivier waves. Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries. Summary number 4877, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Texaco Royalty Fund budget as revenues and expenditures as submitted. Motion by Mr. Paul Landry and a second by Mr. Olivier. Is there any discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Summary number 4878, an ordinance adopting the 2018 road construction projects and projects fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. Motion by Mr. Olivier and a second by Mr. Trahan. Mr. Trahan? Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Summary number 4879, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Community Development Block Grant Program Fund Budget of Revenues and Expenditures as submitted. Motion by Mr. Brown and a second by Mr. Olivier. Mr. Brown, any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. Summary, that motion carries unanimously. Summary number 4880, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Sewer District Number 1 Fund Budget of Revenues and Expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Paul Landry and a second by Mr. Trahan. Mr. Paul Landry waives, Mr. Trahan waives. Any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That ordinance passes unanimously. Summary number 4881, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Sewer District Number 1 Port of Iberia Fund Budget of Revenues and Expenditures as submitted. I have a motion by Mr. Paul Landry and a second by Mr. Trahan. Mr. Trahan? Mr. Trahan waives. Any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries unanimously. Summary number 4882, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Airport Authority Fund Budget of Revenues and Expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Olivier and a second by Mr. Paul Landry. Mr. Landry? Mr. Landry waives. Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Hearing none, please vote your machines. That motion passes unanimously. Summary number 4883, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Acadiana Fairgrounds Commission Fund Budget of Revenues and Expenditures as submitted. I have a motion by Mr. Paul Landry and a second by Mr. Olivier. Mr. Landry waives, Mr. Olivier waives, and Mr. Landry waives. Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion passes. Summary number 4884, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Waterworks District Number 3 Fund Budget of Revenues and Expenditures as submitted. A motion by Mr. Olivier and a second by Mr. Paul Landry. Both gentlemen waive. Any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion passes unanimously. Summary number 4885, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Risk Management Fund Budget of Revenues and Expenditures as submitted. Motion by Mr. Paul Landry and a second by Mr. Olivier. Both of the gentlemen waive. No other discussion? No objection? Please vote your machines. Mr. Michael Landry? That motion carries unanimously. Summary number 4886, an ordinance adopting the 2018 Unemployment Compensation Fund Budget of Revenues and Expenditures as submitted. Motion by Mr. Brown and a second by Mr. Paul Landry. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown waives. Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. Summary number, that motion passes unanimously. Summary number 4887, an ordinance adopting the 2018 non-expendable library trust fund budget of revenues and expenditures as submitted. I have a motion by Mr. Brown and a second by Mr. Paul Landry. Both of the gentlemen waive. Without any other discussion, no objection, please vote your machines. Summary number 4888, an ordinance adopting the capital improvement fund budget for 2018 to 2022 as submitted. A motion by Mr. Paul Landry and a second by Mr. Gonsalan. Mr. Gonsalan? Mr. Gonsalan waives. Is there any other discussion? Any objection? Please vote your machines. That motion carries. All right. I'll need a motion to adjourn. I have a move by Mr. Landry and a second by Mr. Pollard. Consider the meeting adjourned.